Welcome, everybody. I'm Jimena Perry. You already know me. I'm the project manager of the IAPH Explorers, and today we have a very special, and we are privileged actually to have this guest with us. I'm going to introduce her, and then she will go and give a presentation. We have with us Clarissa Siglio. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. And the title of her talk, I'm sorry, is Long story short, museums, public history, and persuasion. Clarissa is an associate director of research for Greenhouse Studios, a research unit at the University of Connecticut, where she is also an associate professor in the departments of digital media and design and also history. Working at the intersection of public history, museum studies, and digital media, she collaborates with museums, libraries, and communities on interdisciplinary public-facing projects that engage diverse audiences in topics of contemporary concern. Her chief research interests are museum history and material culture studies, particularly as they relate to concepts of civic identity, belonging, and exclusion across the 20th century. Siglio is also the author of A Cultural Arsenal for Democracy, the World War II work of U.S. museums, and contributor to Radical Roots, Public History and a Tradition of Social Justice Activism, and the 2024 volume U.S. Museum Histories and the Politics of Interpretation. And as we were talking before, she's also at the advisory board of Public History Weekly. So Clarissa, thank you very much for accepting this invitation, and the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much, Jimena. My goal for today is to share what I've been working on and thinking about as a means not to draw hard and fast conclusions, but I hope rather to open up conversation between all of us who are gathered in this virtual space as we think about the place of persuasion in public history, particularly when we embrace the storytelling paradigm to describe what we and our publics do. So I have some prepared slides, but I hope you'll be ready for the questions that I'll be posing to you. And of course, I welcome the questions that you wish to pose to me. And because we're an intimate group today, I encourage you, if you want to stop me midstream, because our series has a beautiful embrace of less formal talks. And so while I have a somewhat formal presentation, I welcome the informal opportunities for conversation that I hope will be generated today. And I will switch to screen share. So let me begin with a few words about the title, A Long Story Short. I hope I keep my story today short, but in essence, what is every telling of past people, places, times, events, and meanings, but a much longer story told short? The availability or lack of sources, the gaps that go unobserved, those that are pursued, or those that are knowingly created, the methodologies and ideologies that guide research and interpretation, the mediums that express the message. All these and more constitute, as Michel Rolfe-Trouillot observed, points of power within the production of history. To state the obvious, history as a discipline centers narrative as its chief product, its primary output, whether that output takes the form of a scholarly monograph, a comic book, a film, a podcast, an interactive, live, co-constructed experience, or a game. Now, at this point, it would seem useful to delineate two terms that are important to our conversation today, terms that are often used interchangeably: storytelling, and narrative. Now, of course, these are terms as expressed in English, and their expression or alternate terms in the other languages that our International Federation of Public History speaks might carry rather different definitions and nuances. But in English, at least, story and narrative have definitions that vary by discipline, and often these contradict each other. Even looking back at my own writing, I can see a lack of rigor and consistency in how I've engaged with these concepts. So my first question for our group is, you define, or maybe to make it less pedantic, when you think story and narrative, what are the ways you use and mean these words? And if you're not using English, what are the terms that are meaningful in your practice?
Can I go?
Yes.
When I use, I'm a public historian too, but when I use storytelling, I think about like more intimate accounts, like perhaps more oral histories, or perhaps interviews or testimonials, or things like that. And when I think about narrative, also because perhaps I'm also a professor, I think about like more academic and elaborate texts. Maybe it was also the way I was trained in my own university, but I also like, not boring academic tests, like fluid things, but let's say a little bit more formal. That's what comes to mind to me. But I don't know if the public has other ideas.
I can jump in. I would say, building off of what Jimena was saying, absolutely. I think there's an implication that storytelling is somehow more relative, personal, maybe, open to bias, and narrative is maybe a little bit more authoritative, but there is still an implication that there is some kind of crafting of the evidence. I think even when you use the term narrative versus a more empirical and I think that speaks to still present debate within history, even public history.
Yeah, I love the way those two explanations work together and are, I think, so familiar to all of us. Anyone else, or maybe different terms in other languages that you may be using that are more common or carry different nuances?
Yes, hello. I will say, because I'm work in French, that storytelling, you can, for me, is like also more dynamic, like for big public, also like a student audience, before than academia, I will say. And in French, we use narrative. So for me, it was like all the same in English, but because I'm used to use narrative all the time, but maybe I'm wrong, and I don't know in Spanish would be the difference as well as in English. Yes.
I speak Spanish, so in Spanish for me would be like when I hear the word narrative in Spanish, for me it's a little bit more like literature, like a little bit more like a novel or a fiction, a work of fiction, if you want. And storytelling is a little bit, it would be like a little bit more, not formal, but perhaps more based on some kind of source.
But I don't think that storytelling exists in Spanish, isn't it? I think that is very English concept.
Yeah, like the art of telling stories in Spanish, no, there's not like a word for it. But if I have to think about storytelling in Spanish, I would go that way.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
And as someone who's just at the beginning of learning German, it was interesting to me that Geschichte, at least for early German learners, is translated both as story and as history. And I know there are nuances there, and I will look forward to my native German speaking friends teasing those out for me. So as I was looking around briefly, and this is a question I'm grappling with and I'm not offering an answer to, and that I relate to those different valuations, hierarchies, and nuances that Amy, Maria, and Jimena have teased out. Those are ones that why is my slide not advancing? Okay, there we go. So a forthcoming book by Amelia Wong that looks at how museum tells stories. She draws from the field of literary studies to note that story is typically defined as an event or a sequence of events deemed worth telling, whereas narrative is a representation of a story. And that we can all think of examples where a story has multiple, even conflicting narratives. Now, for some of the reasons that we just articulated in terms of the hierarchies and values that are differently attached to, as was mentioned, the intimacy, the impact of story, and yet at the same time, that potentially indicating something that has been manipulated or less damningly perhaps crafted, and whereas narrative maybe carries somewhat of a stamp of approval. But Wong, based on this literary theory, presents them as two sides of a coin, where story, once it's even conceptualized within the human consciousness, is only accessible and expressible through narrative. Now, story earlier in my career was not something, it was something I did on a daily basis, but didn't give a lot of thought to. I was previously an advertising copywriter, a communications officer for a small museum, and a journalist in the arts and medical fields. So story and storytelling were part and parcel of what I did rather back then, and they are still part and parcel of what I do, but I've come to feel more critically about them as a result of my academic training, and in part because of the historic work that I've been doing that I will share with you. Certainly today as a teacher, I see story and narrative as something that is particularly important with regard to project-based collaborations with museums and other partners. So whether students of mine are creating a podcast about climate change to accompany an art exhibit at our campus museum, the Benton, or this semester, deciding how to convey a complicated place-based history of settler colonialism, war, indigenous death, and displacement that is meant to enable visitors to the Windsor Historical Society here in Connecticut envision what the place where they stand today might have looked like in the 1630s. It's easy to see, and as any teacher and historian knows, navigating these complicated issues of power and production, particularly within a collaboration and within the demands of a single semester, is a demanding task. And I'm curious to know, and please, again, feel free to unmute and speak up. What are some of the narrative issues that you're currently navigating, whether it's in your research, in your collaborative work or other aspects of your practice? What are the narrative issues that you're currently navigating?
Can I jump in?
Absolutely. Everyone should just feel free to unmute and take the stage.
That question is kind of hard for me to ask because it makes me think a lot about a project I'm working on. Currently, I'm working with a colleague. We are working on grassroots curatorships from Latin American women. So we are interviewing women. And well, first it's in Spanish, so the first issue is we have to translate it into English, which is another issue in itself. But the narrative problems we are having is that we are interviewing them, but we don't want our voices to be the authors of the final product. We want their voices to be there, but we are writing. So that's something that we are struggling to find out how, because I don't think it's just a matter of giving them authorship. I mean, of course, but it has to be more than that. They have to be more than just a name in the page. So we are trying to find a way to write like with too many hands, with where the authority or the thing, it's not on us, but on them, even though it's written by us. I don't know if I make myself clear. I mean, I don't have any answers to that. It's just something that we are thinking of. And I think it's a very deep question now that you mentioned that. It's like something to really consider.
Yeah. And I'm just curious about what people are wrestling with now, right? Not and the answers are the thing we're wrestling toward. Maria, did you want to share?
Yes, I work for I'm working in France for I'm from Ecuador, but I'm working in France for a project that works about post-colonial history in Marseille. And for me, I work as a narrative coordinator for the project, so I have to read the text and everything before we put it on the website. And it was very hard in a point to see what my colleagues, the researchers, wanted to show about this kind of history that it can be very delicate in French society. And my chief always want to have a neutral, can we say neutral point of view. And being neutral for me in this city with that kind of history was, and being also from the South, it was a little bit uncomfortable because I believe that to keep on going with some kind of process of invisualization of the past, nowadays it cannot be done. So in the narratives that we were trying to present and we were constructing, it was very difficult in some points on some decisions. I didn't agree, but also I wasn't the chief. But I think that I always tell what I believe as a person from the South. That I'm also somebody who has my history was also from the colonial time.
Right.
And I think this kind of problems of the narratives we take, we have to really think about it. And I think that we need to have a position, a really point of view of what, not a moral point of view, but when things happen, we cannot erase them. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And those are some large and ongoing concerns that I think anyone that will be engaging in public history will be able to relate to. I want to tell you a little bit how I came to be interested in talking to you today about story as I moved from that place of being an advertising, public relations, communications journalist to becoming a historian who specifically began looking at how museums during the 1930s and 40s came to a place of embracing what was then a very controversial idea that museums should tell stories, and that among a very small, perhaps more progressive arm of the field, and I'm talking about the mainstream field, to get a sense of larger movements within the US, how they came to embrace the idea of social instrumentality, that museum knowledge, collections, and energies should be engaging with topics of contemporary concern for the purposes of not only educating the public, but inviting and even actively encouraging the public to act as informed citizens and to take action on certain social problems. So it's in my recent book and 2 chapters that I've contributed to edited works shown here that I began to deal with the history of US museums' efforts to become agents of change and to encourage that change explicitly through storytelling exhibitions. This is a moment in the 1930s when a reawakened but small progressive movement arose within the US museum field. The country had been shaken by the social, political, and financial disruptions of the Great Depression. The field of museums had been inspired by the adult education movement and New Deal populism. And museum workers, including the first to have received museum education training through organized programs, began to question the civic worth of their institutions during this time of turmoil and human suffering. And they sought new ways to attract and serve the public. Other influences at this time included worries about the power of mass communications and political propaganda, and the ways in which both of those might erode the capacity for informed individual reasoning, which is an essential feature of any participatory democracy. At the time, books, articles, and conference papers offered and debated ideas about the best path forward. And it was in this mix that the idea of the museum as a social instrument was reinvigorated. Champions of this reform believed that museums carried a public obligation, as I said a moment ago, to bring their collections and other resources to bear on civic problems. Such goals led some practitioners to experiment with the then novel and quite controversial idea that exhibitions could be explicitly structured as multimedia stories designed to educate the mind, inspire the heart, and motivate the body to informed civic and democratic participation. As one author put it, every museum and every exhibit must tell a story. Museums borrowed their ideas and techniques from some of the usual sources. World's fairs. These are the front inside covers of two books that studied the 1939 World's Fair in New York and also the Golden Gate Exposition in San Francisco that same year. They integrated new technologies for foldable photographic enlargement and also new ways of introducing in-gallery sound and film. They also drew inspiration from European artists and museums. Just as museums large and small in the 1930s and of different disciplinary types began to experiment with storytelling exhibitions, war came to Europe and then to America. And this put the idea of social instrumentality to the test. These museums, who were already attempting to engage with contemporary concerns, suddenly had a great cause. In certain cases, one can trace an exhibit's development from its initial idea on through to final installation and public reception. And it's here that the many gaps between the progressive ideal that these museums, and again, they were in the minority, advocated for, but the imperfect realization of their efforts can be understood as a balancing act, one that called upon practitioners and their collaborators to navigate what I've called an exhibitionary network, taking a cue from Tony Bennett, but thinking about the ways that techniques, objects, and images circulated among museums, advocacy groups, government agencies, and corporations, sometimes in actual partnership and sometimes through accidental circuits. One case study that I'd like to tell you about is Wartime Housing, an exhibit in 10 scenes. At the time this was being created, U.S. wartime production had created a severe housing problem as in-migrants traveled across the U.S. to take up newly created jobs in manufacturing boomtowns. Inadequate housing supplies meant that men, women, and children were sleeping in tents, cars, and flop houses. The receiving communities were reluctant to build. Reasons included class, race, and regional prejudices, but also historic memory. There had been a similar production boom during World War I, and when peace came, the rapidly built housing was left to ruin and decay, often becoming the substandard dwellings where marginalized populations were forced and directed to live. So an advocacy group of modernist architects, social reformers, and high-powered citizen organizers saw this moment as an opportunity to gain traction for cooperative community housing. Planned developments that included health, childcare, and education facilities, parks, shared spaces, and walkable living, things that were not that prevalent in many US cities at the time. Some in the group had worked with New York's Museum of Modern Art before, so they approached MoMA about an exhibit that would address public concerns and equip lay people with the knowledge needed to engage in this kind of long-term planning so that what was built for wartime needs would serve and last to build a more progressive tomorrow for the communities. The final exhibit is a fascinating example of social instrumentality designed to appeal to visitors' mental, emotional, and physical capacities for purposes of persuasive education. Dramatic uses of light, film, sound, ceiling heights that were raised or lowered to create different senses of being enclosed, or being in light, airy environments all contributed to the design, as did a soundtrack, almost in the style of a radio drama that brought the visitor into the spaces where the ill-housed workers and families were living. And this would be contrasted with the later light, roomy airiness of good design. Now, there was a lot of behind the scenes debate about the tone. Was good housing planning an exciting topic? Shouldn't it be more patriotic? And the resulting effort shows these diverse stakeholders in the ways that it tries to maintain its original intent, but include something to please everyone. And at the end of the day, this vision for social change was given a cloak of wartime patriotism, but nonetheless, it did strike a chord with visitors. One visitor said, "It's an altogether unique experience and the most effective presentation of a social problem in the museum setting." I have another example that I'd like to share, but I'm going to maybe skip over this a little bit because I'd like to create, oh, I see Jimenez. Are you frowning? Should I not skip over it? I wanted to go through this maybe a little more quickly because I've been enjoying the opportunity for us to discuss ideas. But this second example is called The Great Idea, the idea of perfect and free individuals. It was a collaboration of the Social Museum of Vassar College in New York State and the National Conference of Christians and Jews. That organization counted Vassar's president as an active member. The plan that was put before the faculty committee that ran the Social Museum called for the creation of a reproducible tabletop exhibit that, through the use of statistics and charts, would highlight the alarming rise of anti-Semitism, racism, and xenophobia in the United States. Vassar's Social Museum was an interdisciplinary teaching learning lab that gave students experience in what we would today call community engaged research in order to produce the museum's exhibits as part of their coursework. This was not public history in the way that we know it. Students were enrolled in courses ranging from history to sociology, English, economics, and other subjects as suited to the topic at hand. I wanted to share one of my favorite humorous archival moments. Student work doesn't always live up to our collaborators and even our own standards. It took me a long time to figure out what this weird little pipe cleaner construction photo in the archives even was, but apparently in the concluding section of the exhibit, a love thy neighbor as thyself message was communicated as these various figures confront the mountain of anti-Semitism. And the figures illustrate 4 different ways to deal with this pernicious issue, the best one being to go over the mountain. I think then as now, communicating abstract ideas can be very difficult. But this gives you a sense that the exhibit, while polished in some areas, was indeed student work. What seemed a compatible match with the council even covering the costs of producing the exhibit faltered when their point person sought full control over exhibit content and suggested that an ad agency handle design. And when we see the stick figures, we maybe understand their concern. But the faculty committee drew a line, informing Vassar's president, the museum is something more than a collector of statistics, and we will not deliver the college outright to a propaganda agency. Here it is important to remember that in the 1930s and early 40s, the term propaganda retained its broader, less fraught meaning to disseminate or propagate. So in museum literature of the period, it frequently means nothing more than garden variety press releases or promotional efforts, unless the context makes clear that its second pernicious meaning is being invoked. In this case, the social museum used propaganda to emphasize its ethical obligation as an educational institution in distinction to the council's role as an advocacy group dedicated to promoting a particular viewpoint, and in contrast to ad agencies as communicators for hire. The collaboration proceeded on the museum's terms, and it became one of its best attended and most widely covered exhibits. The council benefited from the national print and radio coverage, but the students' work, which filled several rooms, lacked both the professional polish and the compactness needed for that tabletop exhibit that the council had wanted to send out to its field offices. Still, the great idea is remarkable on several counts. To build its case for greater tolerance, the exhibit opened with a summary of the nation's dark legislative history. It called out specific bills and legislative acts that thefted native lands, restricted immigration by race or creed, segregated people by skin color, and limited voting rights. These and other historical facts that were inconsistent with the great idea of democracy as enshrined in the Bill of Rights placed the current injustices that the exhibit also engaged with into a longer lineage of American history as a means to refute the then popular claim that these current infringements were nothing more than isolated wartime measures. Indeed, Vassar's Social Museum was perhaps the only museum of the time to directly address the immigration policies that denied Jews sanctuary. Likewise, it decried the rise in discrimination against American and foreign-born Japanese, Germans, and Italians. The great ideas stimulated conversation among the many school groups, scout troops, and local civic, business, religious, and women's organizations that attended. Not all agreed with what they encountered in the exhibit. It was reported that several persons have objected to the inclusion of the Japanese. But, said the organizer, I feel we cannot ignore their contributions and problems just because we are fighting them. She continued, still others fear that Negro education will cause a thinning of the ranks of cheap labor. Now, neither wartime housing nor the great idea were free of prejudice. Their critiques and calls to action largely remained blind to their own systems of power, privilege, and in both cases, majority whiteness that we might routinely today call into question. These past practitioners were reflective in their own ways. Correspondence, meeting notes, and other sources reveal their awareness of the forces that were shaping their work, as well as their attempts to find compromise and balance. Still, these works have tended to be dismissed along with ones that are outright propaganda, having been produced by government and self-named propaganda agencies distributed to museums and shown at museums. But I think it is important that we look back at this history and parse out the differences that social instrumentality sought to advance. Social instrumentalists argued that museums needed to become more adept educational storytellers in order to bring a clear, rational voice to the marketplace of ideas. The dilemma, as they understood it, was how to use the strategies that made mass media messaging and even political propaganda emotionally compelling without also becoming agents of indoctrination. Those who championed social instrumentality believed that this was a line that they could walk. My reason for calling attention to social instrumentality and storytelling of the past is that it provides a provocative backdrop against which to consider storytelling in our own time, and how we now conceive of the lines that we must walk, particularly when we adopt this storytelling framework to describe our work and in teaching students how to do that work. I wanted to pause for any questions. I do have a little more that gets us into thinking about how storytelling, as I've just described, became the new thing in the 30s and 40s, and how, although it's never gone away, it has definitely seen a reascendance in the museum field and broader cultural literature, particularly in our 21st century. But I wanted to hear from you in case you had questions at this point before I go on.
I have a question.
Absolutely.
That I don't know, I mean, it's a question that I struggle with my own teaching. I teach at Iona University in New York. It's a small college of liberal arts. It's a Catholic institution. And I am so very not neutral in my teaching. And that has caused not problems, but sometimes there are controversies, and I welcome them. But sometimes I found that some point of view from students can be like radically different, which is fine. I don't have a problem with that. But then I go and trying to make students understand that we should go beyond descriptions. And it's not enough to repeat the content, but to do something with it. But then I struggle. How far should I go with the non-neutral thing? Because I have been accused of being very leftist. Or where's the balance? Where's the equilibrium? Where to stop? For example, when I talk a lot about police brutality and racism, I am zero neutral or tolerant with that. Zero. So it's like where to stop, how to convey that you need to take a stance and that it's okay to take a stance, but that stance also means you cannot, being racist is not a stance. So I struggle with that. It's like a comment, reflection that you made me think of, but also any pointers of a more experienced teacher would be also welcome.
Yes, thank you. I just somehow changed my screen view, and I'm trying to
Saving the future.
Yeah, if people who are not speaking can mute themselves, that would be great. Thank you. Because there's some kind of echo. Oh, okay. Thank you, Amy, for that.
Great, thank you. Sorry, I'm having a issue with my screen at the moment. where oh, there I am. Sorry, wait a minute. Sorry, I clicked a wrong button. Shame on me. And now I've got there we go, that's better. Okay. I don't know that I have the belief that there's a one size fits all answer. And certainly as someone who came out of writing traditions and who thinks about collaborative projects as an intervention, so whether it's an exhibit, a podcast, human-centered design asks me to foreground who is the recipient, community, audience, user. All these terms are specific and sometimes inadequate to describe the humans for who we are creating something. And for me, the work always starts with my students and with our collaborators with the creative brief. Understanding the mission, if it's a collaboration with an institution, and getting to understand the institution's objectives, but also I'll use target audience for the sake of convenience, as imperfect as that can be coming from advertising and marketing, but also what are the needs and interests of the humans that we are creating this for, and always recognizing that there is no such thing as the general public, and that I always like to think of what is the work going to do out in the world, and that I am encouraging my students to tell history with a purpose, and negotiating, arguing, and coming to a balance or integrating different points of view is part of that struggle of collaboration. I can also say that I've found it useful to introduce to students the paradigm of the 4 types of truth that came out of the South African Truth and Reconciliation Committee, and which the International Coalition of Sites for Conscience also integrates into that work, to help students understand that truth has multiple facets, and historical factual truth is one of them, but there are other truths that we can consider, particularly as we think about what is the work that our project is meant to do out in the world. So those are some of the considerations that I think through. I don't know if they're an answer. I'd be curious if other guests have other ideas that they'd like to share.
Chris, I noticed one of the books that you were spotlighting, the subtitle was Museums Never Neutral.
Yes.
I thought that was such a great subtitle because that's something that definitely has informed my scholarship and my teaching. Is I think that we have an idea, and I mean, it's like that is a hard scenario, especially if you're getting pushback on that stuff. But I think this idea that somehow we were neutral at one point is just like, that needs to get thrown out the window. Before coming to history, like my background was library and archives, and even in taking the history degree, I've had colleagues say, well, libraries and archives are neutral. And I was like, we've never been neutral. Like, let's cite all these different examples. I mean, one of the largest ones, obviously, we're wrestling with, I'm based in Canada, is with Truth and Reconciliation, and of course, the history of residential schools, and the fact that we overlooked oral testimony as a valid, truthful form of documentation. And it took, unfortunately, finding bodies for people to suddenly be like, oh, well, I mean, but one thing, of course, in Canadian history, folks overlook is beyond the terrible history of residential schools, we also destroyed most documentation from history of institutionalization and eugenics, and most countries also did that. So it's just like there's so many concrete examples you can point to in which these institutions that we somehow think were neutral were in fact never neutral, and we're operating under certain agendas, or we all have stakeholders that we, respond to, grants that we write, certain targets that we have to meet. And it's just, I think, but that is a hard thing. Even I taught this past semester, and that was hard for both of the classes I was teaching. It's just there's an underpinning belief, I think, that folks still have, that somehow neutrality and objectivity not only is feasible, doable, that somehow we should be aiming towards that, instead of recognizing, that there are multiple truths. And also we're always bringing our own positionalities and perspectives to what we do.
Yeah. And two things. One thing that these past examples, as I dug into the archives, and please, current public historians and creators of collaborative projects, save your documentation so future generations of historians will understand how the final product got to be the final product, and all those negotiations, discussions, and the ways in which multiple forces are at play in shaping narratives. But you mentioned Museums Are Not Neutral. That book, which is just came out this year, Laura Schiavo is the editor, and it's the chapter on the social museum. But Museums Are Not Neutral as a term, LaTanya Autry and Mike Mirakowski, and I apologize if I mispronounced his name, those two were instrumental in the Museums Are Not Neutral hashtag, and the whole social movement galvanized around, particularly in the wake of George Floyd's murder, the Black Lives Matter movement, and that really is the citation credit that I feel must always be brought to the forefront, and is of course credited in the book, whose subtitle that you mentioned.
Yes, just as a comment, like this your intervention and Amy's intervention resonate a lot with me, being from the global South, being like well, I'm from Colombia, like having practiced, having worked in museums, like in still, if you can say, colonial settings, and with a lot of like disadvantages, like being neutral can be even more harmful than to pretend to achieve a supposed objectivity. It could be so detrimental still that I think it's part of our duty as public historians precisely to say no. And I like very much what you said, Clarissa, like history with a purpose. I have found that very hard for my students to understand. That it's not just a repetition of battles and winnings, or perhaps some cultural diversity that you can tell, but it's other thing. And actually, I like this conversation a lot. I mean, it really resonates a lot with me, and I actually encourage that we should pursue this more.
Yes, absolutely. How are we doing on? Oh, Maria.
Yes, I'm sorry.
No, go, please.
Maybe we don't have a lot of time, but I just want to say that I'm agreeing with Jimena and also with you, Clarissa, because I think that it's important to open the doors for thinking about our past, and also for me it's important to participate in also in this kind of discussions, because if we want to talk, for example, now I'm working with global history, and I think that as an historian it's important to to let all kind of people to talk about them and about their history and their heritage. So that can be also very important when we are talking about the past, all from the academia, but also from the museums, and that's why the museums are very powerful nowadays. Yes.
Absolutely. How are we doing on time, Jimena? Are we?
We're fine. We're fine.
Okay.
Yeah,
Well,
we're fine.
I'd like to throw out some of the contemporary engagements and discussions around story and storytelling as it has resurfaced again as the new thing one more time in the museum field. The early decades of the 20th century saw a gathering of interest around the sensory, the affective, the narrative, and the ways in which these three are joined within museums. Some argued that a new sensory turn in museum studies and practice might constitute a new paradigm. Forget about the museum as temple, the museum as forum. Were we going to see the museum as sensory gymnasium? Indeed, writing chiefly of digitally mediated multisensory experiences, the American Alliance of Museums reported that new techniques, along with consumer preferences for multisensory experiences, might reset the baseline expectation for museums from providers of primarily visual experiences, occasionally embellished with scent, sound, or taste, to becoming experts in synesthesia. I think the matter of ethics is an essential question that we have to be asking of all efforts that are seeking to produce affect, emotion, sensory, embodied experience, with the idea that these potentialities can be directed toward heightening, focusing, or otherwise modifying states of feeling, being, and acting. Also, as the material rhetoric of modern social instrumentality turns to digital technologies such as headset-based VR, whose somatic or bodily cues can ever more precisely convince the perceiver's limbic system that they do indeed inhabit a different person, a past time, or different place, the need for practitioners to develop an understanding of the neuroscience behind these mediated story experience becomes imperative. As I mentioned, story has a history of being the next big thing, or as Cummings said in the 40s, today's museum should tell a story. As before, the idea of story as a transformative power has percolated again into the museum vogue from the broader cultures of business, entertainment, self-help, and other arenas. From about the early 2000s on, U.S. Museum books, workshops, and conference sessions have shared strategies for harnessing the power of story, especially in support of inclusivity, activism, shared authority, and participatory agency, which is all to the good, I hope you will agree. In 2013, for example, the American Alliance of Museums took the power of story as its annual meeting theme, noting, at the heart of every museum is a story. It is often a compelling story, authentic and moving. Recognizing that story, telling it convincingly and well, are skills that can be key to a museum's success. A year later, the journal Inside Philanthropy pointed to the popularity of such radio programs in the US and now podcasts, such as The Moth, StoryCorps, and This American Life, suggesting that storytelling might be the next big thing in museum work as funders and institutions alike sought to engage wider audiences. What is meant by story and the means by which museums tell them now has, of course, different contours than in the 30s and 40s. In 2019, I attended a conference dedicated to the future of museum storytelling, which again highlighted stories as possessing and exerting power. Several speakers considered this power in relation to, as I've noted, inclusivity, activism, and participatory agency. Program topics dealt with technologies and strategies being adapted from the corporate sector, including multimedia, transmedia, and data-driven approaches to storytelling. The latter is the use of audience, media, and other analytics to inform the plot, character, and other creative decisions. A trend that is now accelerating as we begin to collaborate and experiment with generative artificial intelligence. Research fronts include the Peabody Essex Museum's Neuroscience Initiative, which in the museum's own words applies new research on the nature of perception, information processing, and attention systems in order to create new interpretive and design strategies that foster indelible, transformational museum experiences. Interesting examples of mediated storytelling and data-driven experiences include artist activist Karen Palmer, who turns artificial intelligence technologies and immersive storytelling to liberatory ends. Since about 2016, she has presented what she calls emotionally responsive film environments, such as Riot, which the viewer's emotional reactions are measured using facial recognition technologies and algorithms that extrapolate what they're feeling in that moment to change the course of the film's narrative and determine how it unfolds. Through re-watching tense moments amid a protest, her goal is that viewers of the film will learn to regulate their facial expression, their body posture, and thus steer the ending of the film to a more peaceful resolution. Story power, much like propaganda, when that term retained its broader meanings, continues today to receive this popular attention. It is by turns the essence of our humanity and the tool of our inhumanity, as one author has put it. It is deemed advantageous for promoting personal or community healing and empowerment, for building iconic brands and securing customer loyalties, and for winning friends and influencing people. The latter category extends from individual spheres of power attainment to the geopolitical arena of international affairs, where story or narrative remains a favored tool of soft power politics. In fact, Joseph S. Nye Jr., who is credited with coining the term soft power, notes that international affairs, as elsewhere, success is determined by garnering public favor, and that very often boils down to whose story wins. Or as other scholars have said, strategic narrative is soft power in the 21st century. In relation to museums, soft power is often understood in its diplomatic dimensions as the ability to influence behavior using persuasion, attraction, or agenda setting. And I'm quoting from this book, which, if exercised with transparency, inclusive pluralism, and a local focus, holds the potential to enrich a city's culture, economics, reputation, and connectedness. The term soft, however, can obscure the ways in which story and other rhetorical modes rely on representational force to invite or enlist attraction. As one scholar aptly summarizes, soft power should not be understood only in juxtaposition to hard power, but as a continuation of it by different means. The term soft also, I think, obscures the ways in which storytelling and similar rhetorical modes today increasingly integrate those emotional, affective, and somatic cues that I previously mentioned, and as these become possible through newer immersive technologies. When they are used to produce embodied effects, neurological responses, and dispositional alignments, there are many ethical lines that we have yet to fully consider. And we must, I think, undertake well-designed studies to learn how to walk them, in addition to bringing, as public historians, our reflective practices into their making. Lastly, as Varied Fields note, story matters if we believe that social epistemology and social ontology happen through narratives. That is, that we come to know and understand and make sense of the social world through narratives. And as others have argued, it is through narrativity that we constitute our own social identities. And this is why story power comes with great responsibility and demands continued critical thought as we invoke this framework. And I'd like to leave you with this provocative quote and hear from you. Thank you.
I have a question,
Yes.
if I may. Would you, or do you think, or are you using a narrative like a kind of synonym of persuasion?
No, I'm not. I hear the term both in the 30s and now tends to be story. And as we mentioned at the outset, there is no single, everyone in every discipline seems to agree, definition that clearly distinguishes story from narrative. And I loved that we each talked about the different values and emotional associations as well as intellectual valuations that can be attached to story versus narrative as we encounter them and use them and think about them in public history. Narrative shows up in the literature in the present day in those kind of slippery ways. Does it mean story? Has it been clearly distinguished at the outset by the author of a work, how they are distinguishing story, narrative, and the relationship? So I don't think either one needs to be inherently persuasive, but I have been interested through that work in US museum history in the 30s and 40s with museum exhibitions constructed as stories designed to inform the mind, touch the emotions, and motivate action. So a kind of persuasive storytelling. And that's why I've focused on persuasive storytelling within museum contexts in the present, because that is something I'm interested in. And I clearly know more about the history of it during the periods I've studied than this still emerging present. And I've just going through the process of watching new books that are coming out on the subject, going to conferences, attending sessions, and thinking about this as I do my own work. For example, we're doing a headset-based history quest dealing with the Nuremberg trials at the end of World War II. And we have a purpose. Our purpose is to increase primary source literacy. So that's a pretty conventional educational purpose. But we have a social purpose too, that the continued troubling rise of anti-Semitism in the US and elsewhere, and the many false stories that propagate online, the conflicting stories, even if they're not meant for a purpose, but are educating people, is a space where, to echo what others here have said, I feel a stance must be taken, and increasing primary source literacy of the period is not controversial, but hoping to conduce it to someone who wants to advocate awareness of that history, and in ways smaller or larger be a voice against anti-Semitism, is persuasive storytelling that will appear in this experience. And thinking through the ethics around that, as well as the ethical commitment against anti-Semitism.
Thank you, Clarissa. I invite someone, people from the audience. If you don't want to talk, you can post your questions in the chat and I can read them. That's also things we have done before, or if you just want to jump in.
Please jump in.
I have another question, but I don't want to monopolize. Thank you, Amy. Go.
No problem. I had a question about just training of museum professionals. Like, in an ideal world, what would you love to see in terms of at that pedagogical level, like training of museum professionals or ongoing professional development, to sort of make folks more aware of this and like have more critical questions around storytelling and narrativity?
Not having been in a museum studies program very recently, we do not have one at UConn, and although I integrate my museum studies and digital public history work of a piece, I can't speak in a way that is addressing how it is taught in the US and what the differences of that may be at different institutions. But I know from my past training and former work full-time in a museum and now as a part-time collaborator. The busyness of day-to-day operations, managing collaborations, finding consensus, and particularly for those practitioners who are addressing issues of diversity, equity, inclusion, community, collaborative, co-creation, and I think they are bringing in critical awareness of stories. So I don't know that there's, among the set that I run into, let's say, at the National Council of Public History, International Federation of Public History, American Alliance of Museums, and even more local New England Museum Association, the Connecticut League of Museums. When it comes to the crafting and telling of history, I do think people are aware of how difficult and how many decisions need to be made. I don't know that there's really enough time once one leaves school to really tap into the history of where museums have been in these places and what that history might mean for contemporary practice, which is a nice shout out. Together with colleagues, I'll be part of a panel in Utah at the National Council of Public History, where based on the book about the US museums and the politics of interpretation, several of us who contributed to the book, some who are working in academia and some who are in museums, we're going to discuss, so what does this history mean for today and around interpretation. So I'm not answering your question directly because I don't know that I have a good answer, but certainly as a practitioner, I think we just need to study and understand more. What do we mean when we talk about harnessing the power of story? And going back to truth. In looking at the past, there are examples that are clearly identifiable as patriotic propaganda, both through their message and the context of their production. Then there are others that once we get into their making, and maybe their intended message more than the final message, we understand we're actively working against being propaganda. And that until we get into the middle of the making, it's that murky middle that can be hard to decipher, right? Certain things we know are mistruths, propaganda meant to distort one's understanding of evidentiary facts. And then there is purposive education designed to achieve certain aims. And they're different, but it's that murky middle that is interesting to me as a researcher. And how will we be judged, of course, 40 years from now, if we don't leave those records that talk about how we tried to grapple with this? Yeah, it's the questions right now for me. I don't have answers, and especially the closer I get to the present moment. But it's certainly something I'm thinking about most every day as someone who is telling stories about history for all the reasons that this group identified and some of the positive associations that we have with story as a word, as opposed to associations that may come with narrative. I'm hoping when Amelia Wong's book comes out, it's based on her dissertation at the George Washington University. She works, I believe, at the Getty Trust, that it will delve more deeply into how within the museum field we can separate these terms and understand how to perhaps use them with greater precision.
I have a question. No, first Maria Jose.
Sorry, Jimena. I have a question, but I think it can be a little bit personal, a little bit intimate, because it's something that when I read your quote, it made me think that, for example, I love museums. Is the subject of my research from years, and I work with them also a long time. And but I think that I have a problem nowadays when I go to the museums. I think like I have some kind of mental fatigue, frustration when I go to the exhibits, or to go just for see what's going on. And I think that even if there are some beautiful things and very beautiful objects, I think everything says the same thing for me, and they don't go further than what the narrative, the a very something very very scientific, and that's all for me. So I think that maybe there is something wrong with me, or maybe there's also a crisis in the museums also. And my question is, what do you think that we can do as historians, but also what can we do as audience in this kind of moments?
So the moments when we feel disconnected from
Yeah.
the museum experience?
Yeah, and then the narratives that they are proposing to us as historians, but also like public. Yes.
Yeah. It's interesting for me as a former market researcher to look at contemporary research studies of museum goers. The Institute of Museums and Library Services in the US has piloted methods of gathering information so that they know they will be gathering information of the US population of museum goers effectively. And I'm looking forward to that study. Each year, the American Alliance of Museums pairs with Wilkening's Consultants, who publishes on their website data stories, so infographics. I think of the Dallas Art Museum. There's a book that looks at its year-long study of different types of museum goers. So museums that have the staffing capacity, time, and often money can be very attuned to the different styles of learners and seekers that walk through their doors. Because no two of us, even if we're walking into the museum together, come with the same agenda, interests, and even the same expectations. So museums do increasingly try to cater to a range of persons. And as we know, becoming more diverse and inclusive and welcoming has been paramount and is still an ongoing struggle for museums. I go to a lot of museums of all kinds and all stripes. And it will depend on my mood. Sometimes, to be quite frank, I don't want to read a lot of text. In the 1930s, they were concerned that museums would become storybooks on the walls. And sometimes we go to a museum that is a book on the wall. And that's a lot to ask of someone who's standing up, walking, and maybe doing other things. Sometimes I want the sense of surprise. And some museums succeed in surprising me more than others. And often that's based on my expectations of what I think I will find. I'll give an example. The Maritime Museum in Maine, I'm thinking, Maritime Museum. That means model ships and lots of paintings of ships. Do I even want to go? But they had a outdoor shipbuilding complex that dated back to the earliest founding of that area as a shipbuilding hub in the United States. I thought, okay, I'll go for that. But they had so many multi-sensory, hands-on, different age activities that we did what I thought was impossible. They said that their admission ticket was good for 2 continuous days. And I thought, who would want to go back for a second day? But we did. And part of it was they integrated in a contemporary exhibit art and science to bring viewers into the underwater world artistically to understand man-made impacts on the Casco Bay that is where the museum is sited. And it was purposeful. It gave me environmental heroes to identify with from multiple cultural backgrounds. It gave me science. It gave me activities. And so I was engaged on multiple levels. So for me, that can engaging me in surprising ways. The bathroom even had great pictures and factoids about bathrooms on submarines, bathrooms on different ships. So even while using the restroom, you were learning. So that's probably an example of a museum that surprised me, defied my expectations, and also with my husband, who, he's a good sport, goes along to every museum. He was like, yeah, let's go back. There's more to do there. So I maybe have become more of a doer in museums. Others I do out of a sense of, I want to see how this history is told. So it really depends what type of visitor you are and what you're seeking. And if a museum experience is not engaging you, to ask why. Think about, is it what's making your eyes glaze over? What's making you breeze through one room to the next? And seeing if you can pinpoint what it is that isn't giving you that experience that you came there probably hoping to find. And I hope too that you're going to a wide range of museums, large and small. And I'm sure you have no shortage where you are.
Thank you.
Well, unfortunately, now we are out of time. But if there's any last comment or any last question, I would ask you my question on another time because it's long. But if somebody else has a comment or something, or if you want to add something, Clarissa, to say something at the end. Oh, Amy.
Kusha, I don't know if you feel comfortable either sharing your slides or even the list of titles that you mentioned, because they were all fantastic. I was making notes as much as I could, but
This is recorded. So
Oh.
so the video is going to be uploaded to our Vimeo channel, and if you want, I can send a copy to the video to your email directly.
It's not so much a video. I was just hoping if there was even like a
Oh,
text, like almost like a podcast, you know, they have the notes, just so I could share also with other colleagues that these are just some, because I was taking notes for my cohort as well.
Sure, I think I have footnotes somewhere for most of the books. Some of the books, particularly those that come from outside the museum field, I haven't read those. They were just an illustration of the phenomena. But certainly the ones that are from within the museum field, yes, I have a bibliography. I don't think my email will be too hard to find if you Google my name.
Oh, okay,
And
that'd be
I'd
awesome.
be happy to send you or anyone a bibliography. And my closing words would be, I hope that all of you and anyone who will be watching this segment in the future will be interested in continuing conversation and sharing ideas as we think about what our current moments embrace of the idea of story power, at least as it's expressed here in the US. And I'd love to learn about its valences in other countries. What do we make of this, and what responsibilities does it carry as we truly begin to engage with the neurological, limbic, and embodied systems for purposes of directing people? I would love to get into more conversations about ethics, research, and how to more deeply understand our responsibilities as technology continues to evolve.
Well, thank you very much, Clarissa. Certainly, this was very, very engaging. At least for me, I enjoyed it a lot. Thank you for your time and for all your knowledge. As I mentioned before, the video will be circulating soon. I just want to tell you that our next event of the Explorers is going to be on February 21st about the Iranian Revolution. If you're interested, I will be circulating that. And I hope this is not the last conversation we have. I hope we can meet also in the future and know what you're up to in the future. And thank you very much. And thank you very much for those who were here. I hope to see you again soon.
Thank you, Jimena, for the invitation, and everyone for stimulate great discussion.